The day began like many others in the bustling heart of the city. The mall, a grand cathedral of glass and polished marble, welcomed streams of families, workers, and wanderers with its promise of luxury and escape. Bright lights poured from towering storefronts, each designed to seduce the eyes and loosen the grip on wallets. Yet, within that ocean of footsteps and chatter, one presence moved differently, heavier, as though dragging invisible chains of class and expectation. Mrs. Langford, a woman accustomed to wealth's glittering armor, entered with her infant son resting in a stroller gilded with gold accents. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the marble, a sound that signaled ownership, privilege, and distance. The baby, though still small, already bore the markings of a life destined to be shielded from struggle. Dressed in silk-soft clothes, adorned with trinkets worth more than an entire household's monthly survival. His presence drew attention not because of innocence, but because of entitlement wrapped around him like a cloak. Trailing behind her, half a step removed from visibility, was Marisol, the maid. She pushed another cart, this one plain, filled with bags, bottles, and the quiet weight of servitude. Her face carried the story of exhaustion, but her spirit, though often pressed down, had not been crushed. And at her side, walking barefoot in spirit if not in body, was her daughter, Imani. Imani was no older than 8, but her eyes carried the wisdom of someone who had seen life from the cracks of society's marble floors. Her clothes, though clean, were faded. Her shoes had been mended by her mother's hands more times than anyone could count. Yet, where her outward appearance seemed simple, her presence carried something unteachable, a stillness, a quiet authority, as though she belonged to a truth the world of money could never buy. The mall glittered with distractions. From candy counters to toy displays, every corner seemed alive with temptation. Children pointed, parents debated, and shopkeepers whispered promises of fleeting joy. For the Langfords, it was nothing more than routine, buying what others could not, consuming as though it were breathing. But for Imani, it was a place of silent study, where she watched people more than objects, seeing the invisible strings of emotion, greed, and longing that tied everyone together. It was within this space that the first ripple of disruption began. The baby, restless in his golden stroller, let out a whine. At first, it was small, a mere signal of dissatisfaction. But like a spark in dry grass, it grew quickly, fanned by neglect and indulgence. Within seconds, the whine became a shriek, a cry that pierced through the mall like shattered glass. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The sound was not just loud, it was demanding, as though the world itself was failing to meet the expectations of one small child. Mrs. Langford, flustered but unwilling to appear vulnerable, bent down to soothe her son. Yet her gestures were shallow, absent of patience. She waved a jeweled rattle, offered candies, even thrust a phone screen into his tiny hands. But the tantrum swelled, louder and louder, until the once casual shoppers around them began to stare. Security guards whispered into radios, salespeople hesitated at their counters, and mothers exchanged knowing looks, the kind born of years raising children without the cushion of wealth. Marisol lowered her eyes, knowing her role was to remain invisible. Yet inside, her heart clenched. She had raised Imani with nothing but grit, discipline, and love that did not rely on possessions. To see such chaos unravel over a child's hunger for attention struck her deeply. Still, she said nothing. The silence of servitude is heavy, and she had carried it for years. But Imani did not carry that silence. She stood still, her gaze fixed on the baby's crimson face, his tiny fists flailing in fury, his cries echoing like thunder in the glass hall. The crowd grew restless, whispers rising. That baby is spoiled. Someone should do something. Look at the mother. She has no control. Each word floated in the air, feeding the invisible storm of judgment and shame. Yet, within that storm, Imani stepped forward. She did not move with haste, nor with fear. Her small frame slipped past her mother's side, her eyes calm, her steps steady, as though pulled by something greater than herself. The crowd barely noticed until she was near the stroller, standing in front of a child who had known only indulgence, never boundaries. Her face was open, clear, unblurred by hesitation. She leaned closer, and though no words passed her lips, the silence she carried spoke louder than the tantrum. Her presence was steady, unwavering, like the stillness of water after a storm. The baby paused for the briefest moment, his cries faltering. His eyes, swollen with tears, met hers. Something shifted. Not fear, not shame, something simpler. Recognition. It was as though the baby saw, for the first time, another child whose world was not built on things but on resilience. He blinked, hiccuped, and the fury that had filled the air like smoke began to thin. The silence spread outward, rippling through the crowd, as people leaned in, unsure of what they were witnessing. Mrs. Langford gasped, unsure whether to be embarrassed or relieved. Marisol froze, torn between pride and fear of overstepping. And the mall, once filled with noise and chaos, seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, a line was drawn, not of wealth or class, but of human connection. A child who had nothing gave peace to a child who had everything. And though the tantrum had subsided, the lesson was only beginning to unfold. For what Imani had awakened in that instant would not only ripple through the Langfords, but would soon challenge everyone who had witnessed it. The mall, with its gleaming walls and watchful eyes, had become a stage for something far greater than a tantrum. It had become the birthplace of a story about humility, dignity, and the unexpected places where wisdom lives. And as the baby's cries softened into silence, the weight of what had just occurred hung heavy in the air. But this was only the beginning. For the eyes of the wealthy, the humble, and the bystanders alike had been opened, and what followed would test not just the Langfords, but the fragile balance between privilege and truth. The hush that fell over the mall after Imani's quiet intervention was unlike any ordinary silence. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier, something unspoken yet deeply felt. For those who had gathered, it was as though they had witnessed a breach in the invisible walls of society. A child of privilege had been calmed not by wealth, not by the frantic hands of his mother, but by the still gaze of a maid's daughter. Mrs. Langford's cheeks flushed red, not from gratitude but from embarrassment. Her entire existence was built on control, over appearances, over finances, over the silent army of helpers who served her family. To have that order broken in public, by a child she considered beneath her notice, was unbearable. Her eyes darted toward the onlookers, scanning their expressions, searching for judgment. And judgment was indeed there, written across every face. Some amused, some softened with admiration, others hardened with quiet critique. Marisol remained still, her hands gripping the cart handles so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She had lived her life in the shadows of other people's expectations. To see her daughter step forward, uninvited, unsettled her. Pride swelled in her chest, but fear quickly suffocated it. The consequences of stepping out of place could be harsh. Yet even she could not deny what had happened. Her little girl had done what no amount of wealth or indulgence could achieve. The crowd dispersed slowly, conversations bubbling in hushed tones. A mother whispered to her child about kindness. Two teenagers recorded the scene, their phones capturing every detail to be replayed across digital screens. Even the security guards, once ready to intervene, lingered at the edges, their curiosity piqued by the shift in atmosphere. The baby, now quiet, blinked up at Imani, his breath shuddering as though the tantrum had drained him. He did not smile, nor did he laugh. He simply looked, wide-eyed, into the face of someone who mirrored none of his wealth, yet carried a strength he could not understand. Slowly, his fists unclenched, and his body softened against the golden stroller. Mrs. Langford, unwilling to let the moment define her, forced a laugh. It was brittle, sharp, the kind of sound that sought to slice through tension rather than dissolve it. She adjusted her diamond necklace, straightened her coat, and pulled the stroller handle closer, placing distance between her son and Imani. To the crowd, she offered a practiced smile, the kind of expression that had once charmed donors and disarmed critics. But today it rang hollow. For beneath the surface, something had shifted. The mall itself seemed to carry the echo of the moment, as though the polished floors and glass walls remembered. Shoppers who had witnessed the scene walked away with new thoughts, seeds of reflection planted in their minds. Some questioned their own parenting. Others reconsidered the sharp lines they had drawn between rich and poor. And still, others, hardened by envy or pride, dismissed it as nothing more than an odd interruption in their day. But for Marisol and Imani, the moment lingered in a different way. As they followed the Langfords through the glittering halls, Imani felt eyes on her. Not cruel, not mocking, just watchful. She did not seek the attention, nor did she bask in it. She carried herself as though nothing unusual had happened, her small hands folded neatly before her, her gaze fixed ahead. Yet inside, she knew something had changed. She had stepped beyond the boundary that separated her world from theirs, and once crossed, such lines are never the same again. As the family entered a luxury boutique, the tension grew heavier. Mrs. Langford snapped at the attendants, her voice sharper than usual, her commands more abrupt. It was not anger at the staff, but anger at the crack in her carefully built facade. Every gesture seemed designed to remind those around her of her superiority, as if by raising her voice and flashing her wealth, she could erase the memory of being upstaged by a maid's child. Marisol busied herself with sorting shopping bags, her head bowed. But inside, she could not stop replaying the moment in her mind. The way Imani had stood, the way the baby had stilled, the way the world had seemed to hold its breath. For years, she had prayed her daughter would rise above the life of servitude forced upon them. Perhaps, she thought, this was the first sign. Imani, however, did not dwell. She wandered quietly to the edge of the boutique, her eyes scanning the mannequins draped in clothes worth more than her mother's yearly wage. She touched nothing, asked for nothing. Instead, she observed. She watched how customers demanded, how workers obeyed, how her mother remained unseen, and how Mrs. Langford clung to appearances. And she wondered why adults believed power came from possessions when, in truth, it seemed so fragile. Outside the boutique, whispers continued to spread. The teenagers had already uploaded their recording to social media, where views multiplied rapidly. Strangers debated what had happened. Was it luck, coincidence, or something deeper? Many saw in Imani's act a reflection of dignity rarely witnessed in such places. Others dismissed it as exaggerated nonsense. Yet the video moved swiftly, threading through digital veins, carrying with it the weight of a story that would not be easily contained. By evening, when the Langfords returned to their car, the baby remained unusually calm, as though some invisible thread tied him to the moment he had shared with Imani. Mrs. Langford, however, grew more agitated, her mind circling around what people had seen, what they might say, and how this incident might follow her. In her world, appearances were everything, and today, her image had been pierced. Marisol settled into the car beside her daughter, her hands folded in her lap. She did not speak, but her silence was filled with prayers. She prayed for protection, for understanding, for the strength to face whatever consequences might come. For she knew that when the lives of the rich and the poor collided so publicly, the aftermath was never simple. As the car pulled away, the city lights flickered against the windows. The mall shrank into the distance, but the memory of the moment lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. For those who had witnessed it, the story had already taken root. And for Imani, though she could not yet know it, the path before her was shifting. The world had watched her step into the light once. Now, the question loomed quietly in the air. What would happen when that light grew brighter, when the weight of truth pressed harder, when privilege and humility clashed again? The silence of the mall had passed, but the echoes were only beginning to grow. And soon, those echoes would demand answers from everyone involved. Night settled over the city like a velvet curtain, yet the story of what had transpired in the mall did not fade with the sun. The video of Imani standing before the crying baby had spread like wildfire. On phones, tablets, and computer screens, the image of a maid's daughter calming a child of immense privilege replayed endlessly. Each viewing carried with it 1,000 interpretations. Some saw it as a lesson in humility, others as an indictment of indulgence, and still others as a quiet revolution unfolding in plain sight. By morning, whispers had become conversations, conversations had become debates, and debates had turned into headlines. Mrs. Langford awoke to messages pinging her phone, some sympathetic, others critical, many laced with questions she could not easily dismiss. She scrolled through comments written by strangers who dissected her parenting, her wealth, her very character, all because of a moment she could not control. She rose from her silk sheets, her hands trembling not from poverty, but from fear, the fear of being seen not as powerful, but as powerless. For the first time, her wealth did not shield her, it magnified her vulnerability. She looked at her son, who rested quietly in his crib, and though his face was peaceful, her own heart was restless. Marisol's morning was quieter, yet heavier in a different way. She sat at the small kitchen table in her modest apartment, sipping coffee that had gone cold in her hands. Imani ate bread in silence, her gaze thoughtful, her movements deliberate. Neighbors had already begun to talk, some with admiration, others with envy. The weight of attention pressed on them, a kind of attention that was not always safe for the poor to carry. Yet Marisol could not deny the truth. Her daughter had done something extraordinary. She had stepped into a world that was not hers and left a mark no one could erase. Still, Marisol's heart carried worry. The rich were not always kind when their pride was bruised, and Mrs. Langford's pride had been deeply wounded. The inevitable came later that week. The Langfords' car pulled up outside Marisol's apartment. Its polished exterior reflected the crumbling walls of the neighborhood, two worlds colliding in one image. Mrs. Langford stepped out, her posture sharp, her face painted with an expression caught between indignation and unease. She carried her son on her hip, the child calm, his small hands clutching her necklace absent-mindedly. Neighbors peeked through curtains, their eyes wide with curiosity. Few ever saw someone of Mrs. Langford's stature enter these streets. To them, it was a spectacle, a reminder of the distance between lives. Marisol opened the door, her heart racing. She bowed slightly, out of habit, but her daughter stood beside her, unflinching. Imani's gaze did not waver. Her face was open, clear, the same face that had calmed a storm inside a gilded stroller. The air between the two women was thick with unspoken words. Mrs. Langford began to speak, her tone rehearsed, yet faltering under the weight of truth. She had come, not out of humility, but out of necessity. She could no longer ignore the way the world had witnessed her falter, nor the way her son responded in Imani's presence. Her words stumbled through apologies and rationalizations, but beneath them lay a simple, undeniable fact. Her child had found peace not in her wealth, not in her control, but in the presence of another. A maid's daughter had given him what money could not. Marisol listened quietly, her eyes lowered, her silence steady. But Imani, still just a child, did not carry the same weight of fear. She stepped forward, her small hand reaching out to the baby. He leaned toward her instinctively, his face softening, his body relaxing as though gravity itself pulled him closer. In that moment, no words were needed. The truth was written plainly. Connection is not purchased, it is earned. Peace is not commanded, it is nurtured. Mrs. Langford's eyes welled with tears, though whether from shame, relief, or something deeper, even she could not say. For the first time, she saw the world not as a hierarchy of wealth, but as a fragile balance of humanity. She saw that her riches, her control, her carefully curated image, all were powerless against the simple strength of a child's presence. The visit ended quietly, without grand promises or sudden transformations. Yet it planted something inside both families. For the Langfords, it was the beginning of humility, the first step toward understanding that privilege without compassion is a hollow crown. For Marisol and Imani, it was the proof that dignity, even in poverty, carried a power that could not be denied. As the car drove away, the neighborhood slowly returned to its rhythm, but the memory lingered. Imani stood on the steps, her face lifted toward the sun, her eyes reflecting something larger than her years. She did not seek glory nor recognition. She carried only the quiet strength that had been hers all along, the strength the world had finally been forced to see. And so the story of the tantrum in the mall became more than gossip, more than a viral clip. It became a lesson whispered through communities, told in homes, replayed in minds. A reminder that sometimes the smallest voices carry the deepest truths. The rich baby had lost control in the glare of luxury. The maid's daughter had stepped in, steady as stone. And the world, for a brief, unforgettable moment, had been forced to listen.